Being a gamer for most of my life, I've played quite a few systems. People will always have their favorites for one reason or another. Be it a certain game, a certain memory, a certain victory. Mine just happens to be the super motherfucking Nintendo. I'll try to be as in-depth as possible, but a large chunk of the following review has already been covered in my Evolution of Home Consoles episode. So go check that out if you're super interested. Starting back in the early 90s, Nintendo was still riding the trail of money made by the original NES. NEC and Sega had already released their 16-bit consoles, with the PC Engine and Genesis respectively. But being the forward thinkers that Nintendo are, they were already designing a successor to the Nintendo Entertainment System. This new system, originally called the Nintendo Entertainment System 2, would be designed around a new 16-bit architecture, and Nintendo went with that idea like gangbusters. The CPU powering the system was a Ryko 5A22, clocked at 22 MHz. That's nearly 20 times the processing power of the original NES. This gave programmers much more power and versatility when designing their games. The video processing power, I think in retrospect, is really where the SNES crushed all other consoles. Not only with the use of very detailed and animated sprites, but with the much touted Mode 7 graphics, which allowed the console to shift, rotate, and scale sprite layers in order to achieve pseudo 3D looking graphics, which was mind-blowing at the time. This effect is easily seen in many games such as the Bomber in Contra 3, and the entire background layer in F-Zero. Not to be outdone by the GPU, the SPU is also very powerful, and was responsible for allowing us gamers to enjoy some of the greatest video game soundtracks in history. The Sony SPC 700 was capable of 8 channels of 16-bit stereo output, allowing multiple, simultaneous sounds, instruments, and noises to be played at once. Some of my favorite soundtracks appear on the system, including Super Castlevania 4, Donkey Kong Country, Contra 3, Final Fantasy V, Mega Man X, and too many others to list here. Unlike the Sega Genesis, the SNES would only have a single console revision, released in 1997, which reduced the overall size by about 40%. This was the version I owned since I had no way to buy the original one before they went out of production. The SNES was a top loader compared to the original NES, which was a side loader. This helped eliminate the dreaded flashing screen and flashing reset button errors that were so common with the NES, and was the main reason we gamers started blowing into the cartridges, although this didn't do jack shit because the majority of those errors are caused by connection issues between the cart and the slot, not dust. Damn it, getting off track. At the time the console was discontinued, there existed around 800 or so games for the SNES, including titles that were exclusive to certain territories. There also existed a plethora of additional controllers, peripherals, and other add-ons. Besides the usual turbo and arcade stick controllers, the SNES also had an updated version of the light gun, the Super Scope 6. Basically a wireless bazooka-looking device. I've played with it a few times, and while it worked better than the NES Zapper, it still had its shortcomings. There was also the Super Game Boy, which was a cartridge shaped like an NES game, but had a slot in the top to insert a Game Boy game, allowing you to play Game Boy games on your TV and in color. Lastly, although it was in development, there was a CD add-on design that never made it to the market. This would go down in history as the genesis of the original Sony PlayStation. Finally, Nintendo was forward-thinking in its console design, as it allowed the future integration of game-specific chips installed within the game cartridges themselves, as opposed to having expensive chips built directly into the console itself. The most notable of these is the Super FX chip, allowing the first game to use it, Star Fox, to render polygonal shapes and objects in a time when other polygonal gameplay was 5 to 6 years away. Another secondary chip used only in Japan allowed gamers to download SNES games from special kiosks onto flash memory cartridges. Damn Japanese always get all the cool stuff. There have been many SNES emulators over the years, most notably SNES 9X and ZSNES. These started to appear as early as 1994, but I don't remember using them till around 97 or 98, when we finally got the internet at home. Nowadays, SNES emulation has pretty much been perfected, with emulators being available across all mobile and portable devices instead of just PC only. In closing, the Super Nintendo really was revolutionary for the video game scene back in the early 90s, and I have no problem listing it as my favorite as well as the greatest video game console of all time. This is based on totality and not direct comparison to modern consoles, obviously. Its incredible game library, featuring some of the best designed, most memorable, and well-received games of all time, cannot be overlooked. I grew up with this system, played the hell out of it, and still continue to play these games to this day, nearly 20 years later. For newer gamers, for younger gamers, maybe ones that haven't grown up in the last decade or so, I cannot recommend going back to this system enough. I've always said that if Nintendo would re-release an updated version of the SNES, I'd buy it in a second, whatever the price was. There's just too many great memories and great adventures to let it slip into the past forever. Thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing, go check it out.